Hello, all. The last few essays all revolved around a key idea that I had resolved to leave in the subtext. But, after intensive deliberation, I changed my mind, because everyone knows subtext is for cowards. So here's my logic. When we are educated, we are taught that the abuses of the system are justice. If the history books mention the crimes at all, they say it is in the past. But we know that the battles fought and the terrorism faced in the fight for human rights are hand-waved to the footnotes. And we know those who didn't fit in have had their lives extinguished and their stories omitted entirely. And every charismatic leader who emerges to call attention to those abuses are killed, and their legacies are diluted. And underneath it all is the hierarchy, which enables those in power to shape narratives, dictate who gets to exist, and denounce those denied that fundamental right. That is to say, those in power dominate the information landscape, and if you know how and where to look, you can see it plain as day every time they attempt to warp and weave the thread of whichever historical narrative they use to fit their current needs. So it is fair to say that we, the working class, have had our history stolen from us. And it is my aim to bring light to this process, since Chomsky is dry as fuck, and to show examples of these processes so that our history, our culture, our heroes, and their sacrifices will not be erased. To that end, this essay will be about moral panics. I don't have time to get into every single outrage, because it's like whack-a-mole, so I've crafted a sampler so that you can get a taste for a good amount of the methods that they use. Part 0, Definitions Jam. For those of you who've never heard of a moral panic, it's a rhetorical strategy leveraged by reactionaries or used to support reactionary ideologies. It requires access to the means of communication and is most effectively done through mass media like television. These moral panics occur cyclically. From a surface-level perspective, the cycle looks like this. Phase 1. Agitation. Use your platform to reveal selected truths like sensational individual cases and lurid facts, while also pushing carefully crafted lies, often in the form of terrifying hypotheticals and slippery slopes. This creates the illusion of support, regardless of the actual amount of people who do support the panic. This works to create a plausible basis for Phase 2, Drop of Manifesto. Demand change from your representatives, most typically bans, censorship, or some other form of state-mandated erasure. This serves as a smokescreen for what is actually happening, an attack on a marginalized community. Phase 3. Start to lose support. When you're engaging in demagoguery, it's a fine line to walk. You have to make the people care, you have to convince them that you're acting in their interest, and you have to engage their suspension of disbelief. Any number of things can derail support for a moral panic. If the people run out of steam, like if the demagogues fail to give them enough targets, like if the demagogues steer the moral panic train into an immovable object. This third phase is analogous to infodom burnout, which I covered in the first essay. It's at this point that the demagogues have to target a new thing that they are not, at that very moment, agitating, and begin the cycle anew. Part 420, Prohibition. Moral panics have been used by people to reach their political goals since forever. Example the first. Let's look at the first moral crusade of the 20th century in America. A widespread movement used information dominance tactics to accomplish a reactionary goal: the removal of the personal freedom to imbibe alcohol. That is to say, they wanted to enforce temperance. The saloon is the devil's headquarters on earth, they said, and by God, they were gonna kick the devil back to hell. Now I might be tempted to call this moral crusade well-meaning but poorly reasoned, like we're taught, especially with the benefit of hindsight that we have. Though realistically, it doesn't matter. We are, as before, looking consequentially at the outcome, not the intent. Sure, temperance was being advertised and disseminated as a means to personally be a better person and a better God-fearing American. But prohibition is not temperance. And when agitating for prohibition, it's not like they didn't use the conceptually neutral language of pointing out that people who abuse alcohol act like assholes. They often batter their partners and their children. The temperance movement also said that the impure habit promoted laziness, sexual perversion, criminality, and indolence, whatever that means, because it feels important to mention. Maybe we'll find out later. But as a matter of course, there's more to it than that, especially considering that the temperance movement had been spinning its wheels on that rhetoric for 80 years. So, what else was prominent during that period? Well, if you must know, nativist sentiments were especially powerful at the turn of the century, and immigrants like Italian, Latinx, Polish, and Irish communities were almost uniformly Catholic, and required alcohol in their religious services. There's also the long-standing racist trope that black people just love malt liquor, and First Nations people can't get enough of that firewater. During this period, the temperance movement had an easy time getting their message out, but a hard time getting the ball rolling because the means of communication were significantly more democratized than in the modern era, so labor and progressive voices had a lot of sway. But things changed. Support for prohibition was sold to women in the States during World War I because beer was seen as German, and the Americans fought against Germany in the war. The fact that being an alcohol abuser meant you couldn't be drafted meant alcohol was pushed as an un-American coward's drink. Between the three primary rhetorical points, protecting women and families, scary foreigners, and be a patriot, reactionary elements claimed they were trying to protect some sort of purity they definitely didn't make up. Rolling out of World War I, America almost immediately passed prohibition. But prohibition didn't fix the social ills that caused the abuse of alcohol, and so it didn't fix the abuses related to the abuse of alcohol. What it did accomplish was criminalizing a part of life that everyone took part in, but poor immigrant communities could now be targeted for partaking. Oh, and as with all prohibitions, the prohibition of alcohol had disastrous results, like the production of The Godfather Part 3. We can see with hindsight how super reactionary prohibition is. But during the campaign, many progressives supported it because the idea of protecting women from violence and making progress in society was able to gain a foothold to those without a more effective systemic critique. Keep that in mind. It might be important in the future. Example the second. Starting while Big P prohibition was still in swing, newspaper magnate and, quote, first fascist of the United States, unquote, William Randolph Hearst teamed up with the Secretary of the Treasury and richest American at that time, Andrew Mellon, to go on a crusade against wacky tobacco. That's dope for you if you're behind on your lingo. We see the same strategy in general terms as prohibition, but it's actually much worse. Hearst had an incredible reach with his newspapers, and the power to control what the newspapers he owned could publish. So Hearst's empire began to spread the imagery portraying marijuana as the drug of choice for black people. Jazz cigarettes, as they were called. You know, during the height of jazz in Harlem. They claimed the use of marijuana was something that causes... just watch.
The devil's lettuce will cause laziness, criminality, sexual perversion, wife-beating, promiscuity, miscegenation, rape, and worst of all, indolence. It is just as dangerous whether or not you inhale, and a physical addiction to Irish oregano is caused after a single puff or slap of a marijuana cigarette, no matter how moral, how diligent, how Christian your sons and daughters are. Once Italian saffron has your children in its grasp, it's only a matter of time before they succumb to the mental affliction known as reefer madness. This horrific dementia is caused when a marijuana addict overdoses on weed joints, as they're also known, and temperance is something that a weed addict can never exert when in the presence of a jazz cigarette. Now that you know, go home and send letters to your congressman, then tell your children, don't fool around with reefer.
This is the first modern media blitz, and it led to illegalization and the effective ban on personal freedom to grow, hold, or use weed in 1937. So, after looking at these, let's elaborate a planning framework about the moral panic tactic while keeping in mind the strategic information dominance paradigm. First things first, make a plan. In the past, everything was slapdash, but nowadays we know that goals should be SMART. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and trackable. So, say your goal is the prohibition of alcohol. Then a SMART goal would be, we will campaign our congressman to pass a statute to legislatively remove the personal freedom to consume alcohol, and to fund a bureau that enforces prohibition and funds periodic reports on how best to curb the continued violation of these laws. And a bad goal would be get rid of alcohol. But again, this is the stated intent of prohibition. What if we could elaborate a SMART goal which would explain the actual outcome of, say, both prohibition of alcohol and the war on drugs that isn't mutually exclusive with the stated goal and is accurate to our historical reckonings? The bad evil goal would look like, we need to disenfranchise minority communities. To accomplish this, we will legislatively remove the personal freedom to imbibe intoxicants and make it illegal thereby making communities that consume these substances into criminals. Once illegal, we will be able to use state and federal law enforcement to attack their community leaders, demonize their wealthy entrepreneurs, and terrorize anyone on the streets, thereby allowing us to denounce them publicly, destroy their social order, and incarcerate or kill them with impunity. Our goal will be attained when they have effectively lost the social capital necessary to effectively participate in government. That seems pretty close to John Ehrenreich's description, and the way they don't outright say it passes for what Lee Atwater said about the Southern strategy. The moral panic strategy requires an instrument, which is a non-political item that you politicize to push your agenda. In our example, alcohol and drugs were instrumentalized. Now that you have a plan and an instrument, you have to find a band. That is to say, a group who will push your ideas and show up to rallies. This is simple. You use the means of communication, newspapers, newsreels, magazines, cable news, etc., to weave a tale that puts your constituency into effective overdrive, so they are too emotional and won't think too clearly about the narrative. The greatest hits for effective override are: say you're protecting women and children. Say the instrument belongs to Satan. Say it causes criminality. Say it causes sexual perversion. Say black people like it. Say immigrants are ruining things. And much, much, much more. Now that you're preying on your band with these instruments, you have to pair factoids with their feelings. For example, alcohol is Beelzebub's tap water because 38% of all homeless people have alcohol dependence. So it must cause indolence, whatever that means. Whether your supporters are bigoted or not, they will now go out of their way to spread the word about the thing that's pissing them off or scaring them or whatever. And they don't even have to spread the bigoted part of any message to spread the factoids, which support the objective regardless. Now that you have a base of supporters who won't question the truthiness of your claims, since you have the factish-sounding sound bites to back up their feelings, you can go to the next part. Push the legislator to create laws that quote-unquote solve the problem. Here is where it's important to point out that the wealthy have an incredible amount of power compared to the average person. It is far-reaching, persuasive, effective, and most of all, effective. More than the power and the access, they have the time. They can continue until they either have the support in legislature or some other probably less favorable outcome. Who knows? When the legislature passes some law in this paradigm, the result doesn't fix the alleged problem. Instead, it increases policing, increases police violence, and destroys the capital and social capital of marginalized groups, without ever stopping the instrumentalized action. Instead, the instrument becomes an expensive, dangerous, and unregulated commodity in a dangerous and unregulated industry. Oh, and power shifts in favor of the powerful. Odd that. Speaking of power, Part 2, Footloose, but without the condescending, bleeding heart bullshit. Moral panics take a back seat during World War II, but afterwards we see it kicking back in pretty fast. Yes. Moral panics take a back seat during World War II, but afterwards we see it kicking back in pretty fast, starting with rock and roll. The cryptos saw the desegregation of the armed forces and could do nothing about it. They saw outrage at lynchings, even coming from white people, and could do nothing about it. But when they saw that music itself was starting to integrate naturally, that was it. The buck had to stop there, because race music played in white dance halls gave visibility and normalcy to black Americans and black culture through the very same media channels that had been used to demonize them. Rock and roll had been called race music, but when Elvis came in like a wrecking ball, it became consumable by white people who were socially and coercively required to avoid things associated with black people. The moral panic's goal might have been to remove blackness from white spaces, but its outcome is that they removed blackness from rock and roll. To quote The Offspring, you've got to keep them separated. So cryptos kick up a fuss. They said that rock and roll leads to sin and promiscuity and crime. Devil's music is what they called it, which is telling, blinks in the nether. Actually, this wasn't even the first time some music got called the devil's music. The earliest I looked to see was jazz. Wealthy capitalists who benefited from segregation were so afraid of the unifying power of music that Henry Ford literally invented country music to fight against the popularity of jazz. Besides rock and jazz, other styles that got the radical devil's music seal of approval were disco, hip-hop, and rap. Each were popular styles founded by black people which were attractive to white people. The other claims about both the people who listen to these kinds of music and the musicians who make it might sound familiar. That they're criminals, abusers of women and alcohol, who corrupt the youth by promoting promiscuity, misogyny, and drug abuse? Wait, that last one is new and interesting. I can't help but wonder how it got there. But you might have noticed that I bulldozed through a century to make that observation. So let's go back and look at something else before I talk about why entertainment media is so useful in this paradigm. Part 69. Nice. War on Fun, or Tyr talks about sex work for infinity minutes. A moral panic starts during the Johnson administration. Pornography has come under fire.
I'd like to begin with a fact, a simple yet shocking fact. It is this: a flood tide of filth is engulfing our country in the form of newsstand obscenity and is threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children.
The claims made by those who pushed this outrage were manifold and often familiar. Porn would cause intellectual indolence by reducing consumption of real literature. It would promote sexual deviance, disease, and women who didn't view sex as shameful. The anti-pornography moral crusade sued anyone they could get their mitts on in order to put an end to the alleged filth flooding newsstands and bookstores. Their biggest lawsuit at the time, Stanley v. Georgia, failed at the Supreme Court level. The Supreme Court unanimously decided that the people may purchase, keep, and view pornography in private places. After failing judicially and legally, the Crusaders demanded an executive solution. To this end, Lyndon B. Johnson announced and Congress funded the President's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography to examine the evidence and give legal recommendations on what they can do to put an end to the obscenity flooding our bookstands and news stores. This commission ended up publishing its report strongly in favor of pornography, despite the political climate being hardline opposed. Whoopsie-daisy. The 1970 report by this commission slowed down the momentum of the cryptos with regards to porn, but they didn't really stop. If we elaborate a SMART goal for the ends of this moral panic, it would include a clause about slowing or stopping women from becoming sexually liberated, since it was started during and in opposition to the sexual revolution. So the goal doesn't necessarily need porn all the way banned, just legally regulated in a way that curtails women's freedom. And since laws were against women already, it just needed to push the conversation away from women's freedoms. This is notable because it's the first time I've focused on an infodom strategy as a deflection tactic. They pushed public attention away from actual progressive struggles, both feminist and labor, and were able to use the finite time and space of mass media to frame the conversation about the creation of sexual imagery in any manner they chose. And they did just that. During the panic, they tried to frame it as obscenity, and many pornographic publications came under fire and often got censored by local governments for being obscene. The vitriol spread by this reactionary agenda was intense, leading to repeated acts of stochastic terror, the most famous of which occurred in 1978. After leaving a courthouse in which he was representing his company, porn magnate Larry Flynt was shot in the stomach through his spine. This wound left him paralyzed and in pain for the rest of his life. Oh hey, he's still alive. Good for him. I hope. The shooter was a white supremacist who killed more than 20 other people, mostly interracial couples and Jewish Americans, at worship, and he injured many more over the 3 decades that the cops just couldn't catch him. He did his hideous deeds mostly by attacking people at community centers and in parks. He tried to murder Larry Flynt because Hustler depicted interracial sex, and he wanted to put an end to that. Because as poet laureate Dexter Holland wrote, "You've got to keep them separated." A few years after the shooting, the entire porn industry faced a reckoning. In 1980, former pornographic actress Linda Borman stood at a press conference with her lawyer and with feminist activist Andrea Dworkin. Borman used this platform to explain what had happened to her. Her ex-husband had beaten and raped her, he had kidnapped her, trapped her in a house, and forced her under duress to perform in the pornographic films for which she became infamous. This disclosure helped kick the anti-pornography movement back into high gear. Instead of just obscenity, which is largely subjective, now they said it was misogynist and promoted violence against women. The rhetoric ramped up, and so did the legal action. Newsstands, bookstores, theaters, and publishers were under often calumnious litigation and often had to shut their doors permanently. This moral panic culminated in the 1986 Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, also known as the Meese Commission. Unlike the last one, this commission was resolved to be anti-pornography, regardless of any facts that came out about it. To prevent unintended outcomes like the previously unsuccessful President's Commission in '69, only anti-pornography speakers and evidence were to be brought to the committee. So when they brought Dworkin to testify, they already knew that her position was that all sex during sex work is rape, and as such, she would be an acceptable witness. When interviewed in the session, she claimed that magazines like Playboy and Hustler, quote, in both text and pictures promotes both rape and child sexual abuse. This claim pairs well with a racist claim that porn promotes interracial relationships and miscegenation, and the Christian claim that porn promotes promiscuity and sin, and that porn is the devil's final frontier. And these claims all sound weirdly familiar. Dworkin also said that obscenity laws don't get rid of the problem, or even curtail it, since it goes after the end product, which is fair and accurate. She also claimed that the treatment that Linda Borman faced was indicative of the industry as a whole, which is citation needed. Finally, Dworkin gave her conclusion, 5 recommendations which I will review as I give them. These grades are made assuming that policing is okay, since the recommendations were made with that assumption, and as such, they would categorically fail under a systemic critique. 1. That law enforcement agencies should keep records on the use of pornography in violent crimes. Not sure how many people bring their porn with them when they go to do a violent crime, but go off, I guess, 4 out of 10. A ban on the possession and distribution of pornography in prisons. That's already a thing and remains a thing. 3 out of 10. See me after class. 3. To enforce laws against pimping and pandering against pornographers. Not sure how you'd enforce pimping and pandering laws if both people who have sex are getting paid for it by a third party. 5 out of 10. Points for effort and creativity. Bad implementation that would hurt sex workers. 4. To enforce RICO against the porn industry. I'm not really sure porn itself could be considered a racket, so this one's a bit odd, but considering that the porn industry had repeatedly been accused of having mob ties, I assume it has something to do with that. 6 out of 10. Organized criminal industry often abuses illicit industry workers, but it's the state that forces them underground. And 5. To create anti-pornography laws which guarantee recourse and provide damages for harm inflicted on women. This is actually a surprisingly relevant suggestion for nowadays, what with nudes getting leaked non-consensually. But before the rise of social media, it would be a law almost specifically tailored to punish what happened to Linda Borman if it happened again. 8 out of 10 with the modern lens, this suggestion is specific and actionable with the aim of curbing abuse. Dworkin's recommendations were influential enough that they went into the final report, called the Meese Report, which found that porn was bad and should be prosecuted and censored more harshly than it is. What a surprise. Dworkin's recommendations mostly resulted in an increase in law enforcement sting operations targeting sex workers, which doesn't exactly help women in whole or in part. I didn't read Penthouse or Playboy or Hustler or whatever during the porn panic, and I'm not arguing that pornography doesn't have a lot of incredibly gross, shitty anti-woman or anti-worker dynamics, either on or off screen. But a link about this subject is in the nether. So let's jump back in time to the 1969 Commission and look at the results which were published in 1970. The earlier commission had found that there is no evidence to suggest that pornography leads to criminal behavior or negative changes in sexual behavior, neither for adults nor minors. It went on to suggest more research into developmental psychology with regards to porn to make a final call on whether it is safe to give minors access to porn, but that adults should be allowed to have it if they want it. It also demonstrated that despite the popularity of porn, its availability doesn't reduce the consumption of other more highbrow media. The conclusion recommended prohibitions on pornography should be eliminated until future research is done which can demonstrate incontrovertibly damning evidence. And so, the Senate rejected it 60-5, 34 abstain, and so did noted piece of shit and American President Richard Nixon. You'll notice the official result of the 1969 investigation and Andrea Dworkin's testimony are largely contradictory, with the report citing evidence-based research and Dworkin's testimony extrapolating systemic harm as a foregone conclusion from anecdotes. The first commission siding with the sexual revolution and the science seems like something that the noted feminist author would be in favor of. But in the years between the two commissions, strange bedfellows were made between the Christian right, the moral majority, a group of parents called Mothers Against Obscenity, the law and order types like Attorney General Meese, homophobes like Save Our Children Incorporated, and academic feminists like Dworkin and her Women Against Pornography organization, among others. And I think this coalition deserves a closer look. These groups created moral outcry after moral panic against sex work and porn and sexploitation films that were made after increased restrictions made it harder to make, publish, and disseminate porn, and against non-pornographic erotic films. And their efforts really paid off. Look at how porn-free our society is today. The concerned parents adopted what is now called the Think of the Children attack from the Save Our Children Incorporated group. And I don't think I have to explain how they instrumentalized children to attack any pro-women or pro-queer policy even to this day. The law and order types claimed that the industry was full of organized crime, drug abuse, pimps and prostitutes, and all sorts of illegality. The feminists claim that violence against women, and the promotion thereof, was consistently present in both the text of pornographic media and throughout its industry. And the fundamentalist Christians claim that porn was bad because the extramarital sexual activity was a sin, and it promoted both promiscuity and divorce by spitting in the face of God instead of swallowing his big if true. This coalition had law and order types, concerned parents, homophobes, racists, and Christians working together, each of which are commonly featured in crypto narratives. But Andrea Dworkin and her organization are a comparatively small population in feminism, who, as a whole, rarely share goals with cryptos, and really ought to not. On top of this, the thing that causes Dworkin's very real beef with the porn industry doesn't really stem from the philosophical parts of creating pornography itself, regardless of her convictions, but instead the profit-driven porn industry and its practices. Even if women like Borman are that industry's cash cows, have you seen how cows get treated? Realistically, the involvement of market forces is what made pornography inhumane to the extent it was and is. So it's a capitalism problem which manifests largely in the exploitation of those with marginalized gender expression. Especially because the freedom for people to choose who, what, where, when, why, and how they consume or do not consume their time with regards to gender and sexuality requires that both the creation and consumption of pornography is permitted and destigmatized, hence the sexual revolution. But equality's needs run directly contrary to the crypto aim to strictly define and control sexualities and reproductive choices, and those aims require them to decry pornography the same way they decry birth control and LGBT people. And we see it over and over even in modern times. Dworkin's 1983 paper, Right-Wing Women, was about the women who get involved with right-wing causes and speak as a totem on behalf of women, and thereby perpetuate or support a patriarchal system. In retrospect, this is deeply ironic, because she was platformed to support the patriarchal system. The year after the Mies report came out, Dworkin doubled down, extending her claims about pornography to all heterosexual intercourse in the book Intercourse. The claim that all heterosexual sex is rape doesn't hold up to either academic or lay scrutiny. The damage to the image of feminism caused by this still haunts public discourse to this day. The result of the Mies report, as part of a rhetorical onslaught from all ideological sides, made it so that regardless of who you were, you heard bad things that mattered to you about porn. While it didn't result in censorship, it did hurt sales of porn, because the image of a person who buys pornography had been damaged to the extent that nobody wanted to be associated with the image of a pedophile, rapist, horse-fucking criminal. That is, until the internet was democratized, and people could get porn on demand in their own homes, and masturbate to it. Thanks, Al Gore. This is why I make the distinction between leftists as a whole and progressives. There is an important difference between them, and this fits into the information dominance paradigm. As I've mentioned before, critical theories that acknowledge the usefulness of an intersectional framework, such as feminist or Marxist, without intersecting the other vectors of oppression, fall flat and generate a non-radical progressivism. These ideologies are very easy to bend to crypto agendas. The failure is often used as a psyop tactic aimed at people of an ostensibly progressive bend, especially academics, to support right-wing ideology. All they need is one lefty stooge to squawk. Once the right wing hears that, they'll let the lefty on their platform. And so there is a totem of bipartisanship to support their bullshit hierarchy. Looking at you, Christopher Hitchens. In his now famous call-out of Tuck the Cuck, Rutger Bregman said, quote,
I just found out that I got that quote from Rutger Bregman, but it's actually a quote from Noam fucking Chomsky. Son of a bitch.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know
don't say
that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Unquote. And this analogy works if you follow the history, because you can tell that academic feminism as a whole wasn't really off the rails like Dworkin was. Judith Butler's Gender Trouble was published 3 short years after Andrea Dworkin's Intercourse, and essentially started the third wave of feminism, because the ideological end of Dworkin's brand of feminism had been reached, and it was wrong. So we're nearing the close of the porn talk, but I can hear you asking, what's the takeaway from all this porn talk? Is there something I, as a viewer, am supposed to do about this? Yeah, I guess. Let people be horny on me. Part 4. Reduce, reuse, and recycle dissent. Speaking of gender trouble, let's talk about the 90s for a bit. We have a situation that continues at a brisk clip, where every time a subversive type of media is popularized, A rush is made by the industry to flood the market with clones, and the mainstream media finds some sort of objectionable thing about it to hold bourgeois people away from it until they can pump those clones out. So let's look at subversive music for a second. You see this when they say grunge is meaningless noise, where Kurt Cobain is critical of gender essentialism, liberal market worship, and aspirational bourgeoisie lifestyles. Kurt Cobain was the first millennial, truly. And the process of reframing radical action to fit a narrative is part of the tactic covered in Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. Link in the nether. The tactic is called recycling dissent, where they strip the story to defang denunciation and curtail critique. The same process hit Ice-T when he made Cop Killer. He explained in an interview that the song was about being fed up by police brutality. The cop in the song is the killer. But cryptos wrap the narrative in moral outcry and force him to back down from using his platform for subversive expression. This process creates an outlet for moderates to dismiss the radical message inherent to art. And even when the radicalism is recycled into edginess, the core of the message is often still visible. In the late 90s, Eminem bridges the racial divide, popularizing rap about working-class people for working-class white people. For this, hip-hop as a whole got called out for misogyny, for violence, for promoting crime, and being the devil's music. It's the same rhetoric from cryptos to keep people talking about individuals with problems instead of systemic issues. Not that Eminem is clear of those accusations, but lived experience informs expression through art. So the question should be, how do we fix the experiences that are leading to this expression instead of just shitting on an adult artist who already had them? But you can see the right wing keeps deflecting and divorcing the responsibility of societal ills, including terrorist violence, from the fascist ideologies that spawn it, while trying to make the public focus on social and metamedia commentaries. In every case, like before, they create target groups by disseminating an image that nobody wants to be associated with, in order to dehumanize their targets. If stochastic terrorism occurs, they blame the violence on any instrumentalized source. And if it doesn't, then they use the police to enforce laws against them, and blame the violence on the targeted group itself. For either end, they bring in as many stooges as possible to spread their message around in whatever flavor they need to sell their crap ideology. Here's where I come back to why entertainment media is very useful for this moral panic paradigm. Nobody has enough time for every piece of media, and it's easier to take the opinion of a trusted agent than go out and investigate every claim they make. And they wouldn't exactly be trusted if you investigate every claim they make. So it's relatively easy to get a trusted agent, or an agent trusted by proxy, to denounce subversive media to as wide an audience as possible, to make it unappealing. This process plays defense for capitalism, and helps maintain every crime and violation of the current system. Earlier, I mentioned Lee Atwater, one of Reagan's advisors, who was well known for managing the information landscape. As I mentioned, his most famous quote is an incredibly earnest depiction of the Southern strategy, pictured here. Well, he got sick after that, and deteriorated through the Reagan years. In 1991, 2 months before he passed away, he had an interview where he said this: "The 80s were about acquiring wealth, power, prestige. I know. I acquired more wealth, power, and prestige than most. But you can acquire all you want and still feel empty. What power wouldn't I trade for a little more time with my family? What price wouldn't I pay for an evening with friends? It took a deadly illness to put me eye to eye with that truth. But it is a truth that the country, caught up in its ruthless ambitions and moral decay, can learn on my dime. I don't know who will lead us, but they must be made to speak to this spiritual vacuum at the heart of American society, this tumor of the soul." Thanks for watching, and special thanks to my Knoll patrons. Catch us next time on Pamphleteer vs. Mecha Trollzilla. I'm on Twitter at Pamphleter&Co, making hot takes about whatever you want, and on Patreon, please support me. If you like the art, you can find the artist at Gremma's Online, or at a rally against Sasquatch music by Grems Against Sasquatch Losers Infecting Grem Homes, T, or Gaslight for short. If you like the music, you can find Brent Entrekin on YouTube and SoundCloud, or doing all the psychoactive substances mentioned in this essay, and much, much, much more. Special thanks to Wuku, a Grandma tier patron who still doesn't have anything he wants me to say. I had a bunch more segments about topics that cleanly fell into the final recycling dissent heading, but they had more ideas in them than what we were looking at, and I feel like I effectively outlined what this essay is about, so I'd either be retreading or drawing this essay to an impossible length by adding more and more things. So I'll just mention them, and if you want me to talk about them in greater detail, you can tell me in the comments. And if not, You can just look them up on your own. 1. Andy Warhol, David Siqueiros, Norman Rockwell, and Soviet Realism. Number 2. Hostel, Saw, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Cannibal Holocaust. Number 3. Rammstein, Edginess versus Subversiveness, Mass Shooters, and Eliding Extremism. Number 4. Jack Thompson's Crusade Against Violence in Video Games, and Violent Video Games. And number 5. Humant, or Human Intelligence.